Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
The risk of a war in the Horn of Africa appears to be growing as Ethiopian troops mobilize on the Eritrean border.
Ethiopia's quest for sea access is irreversible.
Tensions between the two countries have been building for weeks, with the Ethiopian Prime Minister making clear the country wants to regain access to the sea.
I am 1,000,000% sure that Ethiopia will not remain a landlocked country.
On this episode of the Next Africa podcast, we'll look at what's behind these latest tensions and if they really will spill into a new regional war. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Joining us this week is our reporter Simon Marks, who is based in East Africa, and also Kjetil Tronvoll, a professor at Oslo New University College, and also an expert on the region. Thank you both so much for joining us this week. Simon, let's just start with you. Your latest report is now available on Bloomberg platforms. Get us up to speed. What do we know about what's happening on the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea?
Well, what we know for fact is that in recent days and weeks, there has been a considerable amount of troop mobilization inside Ethiopia by the government of Abiy Ahmed, and these troops, reportedly in their thousands, have made their way northward towards Eritrea, yes, but more importantly, perhaps towards the border with the northern Tigray region in Ethiopia, where there is a regional government currently hostile to Abiy Ahmed. It's in some ways a repeat of what we saw 5 years ago when there was a war between the Tigrayan government in that northern region and the government of Abiy Ahmed, who at that point was more recently in power in Ethiopia.
Kjetil, let me bring you in here because as Simon was just walking us through this, how are we now at a situation where war potentially looks likely again after we had thought there was a peace deal and the conflict seemed to be in the rear view?
This has been a conflict long in the making. And we have to go back to the former war on Tigray, 2020 to 2022, where Ethiopian federal government were allied with Eritrea in the war on the Tigrayan regional authorities. It's the Tigray People's Liberation Front. But when that war was settled with the cessation of hostility agreement called the Pretoria Agreement in November 2022, that was only an agreement between the TPLF regional administration in Tigray and the federal authorities in Ethiopia. Eritrea, as a key actor to that war, was not included in the discussions or in the agreement. And we know that soon after that agreement was announced, that President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea was very skeptical to the cessation of hostilities because his objective of entering that war was to crush the TPLF party one time and for all, to annihilate the party and its structure. And the Pretoria Agreement saved the party and restored the party in Tigray as the dominant political force and the regional authority. So already from that time, we saw that the relationship between Asmara and Addis started to deteriorate. And since then, that has escalated, so to say, the hostilities, also because that Abiy Ahmed, a year and a half ago, started to argue quite insistently that Ethiopia needed an outlet to sea, that it was an existential threat to Ethiopia, that they didn't control Red Sea access, meaning the Assab port of Eritrea. The federal government of Ethiopia has insisted over and over again that it is a necessity for Ethiopia to have sustainable access to Red Sea, also to build a naval base. And that has, of course, been a worrying sign from Asmara, from Eritrea, that it looked upon that as a threat, although the Ethiopian government has been very skillful in playing what is called constructive ambiguity, saying that they want an access to Red Sea through negotiations, But if that doesn't happen, well, something else might come into play.
Let's just get into more of this new alliance, because you outline there really how this has shifted. The alliances have shifted over the past few years. Can you unpack more of what we are seeing between Eritrea and the breakaway Tigray region?
This is nothing new, because this is how politics have been played in this region for centuries, that various regional power holders are negotiating alliances and allegiances versus the center, so to say, to try to capture the political center. And because many people think it is quite strange that Eritrea, which was probably the main perpetrator of the gross war crimes committed on the Tigrayan people just 5 years back, that the Tigrayan authorities now enter into an alliance with the perpetrators, so to say. I think as interpreted locally, it is because they feel that they are dying standing up, as they say, because it has been a kind of a containment strategy from the federal authorities versus Tigray. They haven't been able to rebuild after the war. They haven't restored their territories. They haven't restored the full administrative powers. They have not been represented politically at the federal level. So there are many grievances, and they have barely survived. And the humanitarian situation in Tigray has also been deteriorating over the last 2 years. So from the local point of view of the power holders in Mekele, they say that, we are dying as we are by starvation. So let's try to rock the boat to see if we can get a new momentum. And who can help us to create that momentum? They need some new alliances. And then it seems to be that Eritrea was ready then to enter into a dialogue with the political leadership in Tigray to safeguard their own interest versus Addis Ababa. And the federal government of Ethiopia has been accusing Eritrea repeatedly for the last 2 years to fund insurgencies in Ethiopia, the Amhara Fano insurgency, but possibly also the Oromo ULA insurgency. So this falls into a pattern that Eritrea's strategy versus Ethiopia is destabilizing strategy to weaken the security control of the federal government in order to deter them to attack Eritrea.
And we'll just pause right there. Stick with me both, guys. When we come back, we'll look more at how serious the chances are of a major military confrontation after the break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we're discussing the growing fears of a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia in East Africa. Simon Marks is still with me. Simon, how dangerous could a war in this region be, especially considering what we've seen over the past few years and what Kjetil was just explaining to us about what some of the population has still been experiencing?
Well, the last thing the Horn of Africa needs goes without saying is another war. You already have a lot of conflict in this region. Obviously, in neighboring Sudan, for the last 3 years, there's been an absolutely gruesome civil war going on between the army and the rapid support forces. And that has attracted a whole host of proxies regionally, with the United Arab Emirates backing the rapid support forces and other countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, for example, being more closely aligned with the army. And you're seeing these proxies play out also to some extent inside Ethiopia. So any ignition of war could very likely see a repeat effect inside Ethiopia and Eritrea, where you have the Saudis and Egypt reportedly being quite close with the government of Isaias, and the Emiratis having substantially backed Abiy through financing and political support as well there. So there is a huge risk for escalation, and recently you've seen these proxies play out to some extent on the issue of access to the Red Sea, where you have Saudi Arabia closely aligning with the government in Somalia and the United Arab Emirates aligning very closely with the breakaway region of Somaliland. So you're seeing these proxies pop up all over the region, and that will only fuel any war that breaks out. And as for the humanitarian situation, obviously globally, right, we've seen a huge cut in funding for food and humanitarian aid, largely from the US, but also from other countries in Europe. And there hasn't really been much in the way of other regions stepping in to fill that gap. So it's a very precarious situation inside Ethiopia. Economically, it took a long time to recover from the last war, as well as the COVID pandemic, which really crippled the economy and sent Ethiopia on a pathway to defaulting on its debt. It's only just beginning to sort of address that now with creditors. So really, it's not worth contemplating how disastrous it could potentially be.
And we should just add that the UAE does officially deny providing support to the RSF.
It's also interesting when you think about Turkey's Erdogan was in the region over the past few days. And when you think about the proxies and the different relationships that these countries have to countries that are outside of the region. Kjetil, I wanted to get your opinion on that as well. I mean, I see you quoted as saying you potentially foresee a bigger conflict. What's your take on whether other countries could be drawn into this if in fact we do see that playing out?
So both Eritrea and Ethiopia are already engaging in the Sudanese war theater on each other's side. And then you have, as indicated, that Egypt is a very strong backer of Eritrea because of its own interest to destabilize and weaken Ethiopia, so Ethiopia will not exploit the Blue Nile and the Gerd Dam, potentially weakening Egypt's control of the Nile. And Saudi is linked into that alliance directly, assisting Eritrea politically, but possibly also financially in the run-up to a confrontation. The Somaliland and Emiratis are linked on the Ethiopian side, and whereas Somalia, Mogadishu, is on the Eritrean side and in the tripartite agreement between Egypt, Eritrea and Mogadishu. This has the potential to really escalate, and I was just talking on a Norwegian podcast earlier today, and we started to characterize this as a potential Africa's second world war. When you remember, we called the Congo War the Africa's first world war some years back, indicating that you can actually have states from 3 continents, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Africa, involved in the Eritrea-Ethiopian conflict as proxies. It's very, very serious.
And so how imminent could a potential conflict be, Kjetil?
I think what we see now with the huge military mobilization and redeployment of troops and heavy material up north is not by coincidence, so to say, the timing of it. Both the clear warning letters sent by Ethiopian government to the UN and directly to Eritrean government, but also we have to keep in mind that with this we are entering now the seasons of warring in Ethiopia traditionally. It is also a date coming up, which is very symbolic in Ethiopia. It's the 2nd of March, which is the Adwa Day, when in 1896, the Ethiopian Imperial Peasant Army managed to crush the invading Italian colonial army up north in Adwa, in Tigray, in the heartland of Tigray. And we have seen earlier, for instance, during the 1998-2000 war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, that the major offensives from Ethiopia to reclaim what they said it was Ethiopian territory started in the end of February 1999, the Operation Sunset, as it was called. And then later, the final offensive started then in March 2000 to push back Eritrean troops. This is because of the historical significance of this time, but also because of the seasonal changes. They have to win the war before the rains start in early June. So February, March, April, May is the key warring season in the region.
Maybe finally, Simon, we've seen peace deals in the past, as you know, we started the podcast talking about them. Is there any scope for a return to the negotiating table, or is it too far gone?
Well, as it stands, it doesn't look too likely. The regional government in Tigray at the moment, after the last war, it's factionalized. And there was a camp of senior TPLF officials which aligned themselves more closely with the federal government of Ethiopia. And then there were more so-called hardline members of the TPLF which separated and did not join that political force. And at the moment, the pro-government faction has seemingly lost power in Tigray, many of whom have left the Tigray region, gone to the capital in Addis Ababa to take refuge, and it's the hardliners who are in charge up there. It doesn't really seem that the Pretoria Agreement is something that's alive and kicking. If anything, Ethiopia, through its foreign minister, has hinted that the terms of it are no longer valid.
We have seen over the last couple of weeks only a much more intense diplomatic activity. Saudi Arabia, for instance, both the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia recently visited Addis and his deputy visited Asmara in talks to try to mitigate a conflict. Erdogan, as you mentioned, was just there in Addis a few days ago, also addressing the issue. As far as I hear, he was not given any guarantees by Abiy that a conflict would not break out. AU had offered itself to mediate between Tigray and Addis, but sources say that the Ethiopian government clearly told AU to back off. This is an internal affair. You shouldn't meddle into that. One party which potentially could have a leverage is, of course, USA, but it seems to be that the US engagement is just anchored in the State Department. The White House is not on board, and as long as Trump himself or his special envoys are not tasked to address the issue, it doesn't have the political clout to make an impact on either Addis, Mekele, or Asmara.
Thanks so much, Simon. And thanks again to Kjetil Tronvoll from Oslo New University College for walking us through what is increasingly a growing concern in the Horn of Africa. You can read Simon's report on Bloomberg platforms now. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Here's some of the other stories we are following across the region this week. The Democratic Republic of Congo struck a deal to tender copper from a major Glencore operation in the country, expanding the state miners' trading of a metal that's key to the energy transition. And Nigeria's government will channel more of the proceeds from its oil and gas production directly into a central account, a move aimed at boosting state finances. You can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the Next Africa newsletter, of course. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. But for now, I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.